So let's move on to part two. So in part one, we were focused on the idea that death might make life meaningless. Now we're going to look at an argument that immortality makes life meaningless. This argument again comes from Bernard Williams, who we met in section two, lecture 4 on regret. So Williams is one of the well-known British philosophers of the 20th century. And amongst his many works is an argument, a paper on immortality. So Williams argues that death is in fact necessary for a meaningful life. So he thinks that if we were to live forever, that would like the fact that we would live forever, it would be enough to render life meaningless. So immortality is supposed to be, there's no immortal lives. For Williams, there's no immortal lives that are meaningful. All immortal lives, or at least all immortal human lives, are ones that would be necessarily boring. So it seems that actually for Williams, like to avoid this boredom and to have a meaningful life, you have to die. So death then becomes a necessary condition for a meaningful life. And the reason he thinks immortal life would be meaningless is because he thinks it would be boring. Like we would get bored of what we're doing, and eventually we wouldn't want to live anymore. If we couldn't kill ourselves, we would just live in eternal boredom, and nothing would have any purpose, any point. Everything would seem pointless, meaningless. We would lack fulfillment. The reason for this, the reason Williams thinks this, is to do with his view of psychology, or his philosophy of mind. So he thinks that people have categorical desires. We'll discuss what those are in a moment. But basically, Williams thinks that our categorical desires are limited, and that if we live long enough, we'd exhaust those desires. And after we exhaust those desires, we would have no longer any will to live, and everything would be boring and repetitive. And at that point, if we reach that point, we'll want to end our lives if possible, because we'll just not want to keep living. And to argue for this, Williams takes a case from opera. So the opera, I think, is called the Macropolis Affair, but Williams calls it the Macropolis case. So the Macropolis case is about Elena Macropolis, which Williams shortens to EM. So Elena Macropolis is given an elixir of life. And it's just meant to be a potion that renders her imperious to death. This is in a very qualified sense. So she's immortal in the sense that she's not going to age or deteriorate. She'll always stay in appearance as the same age, namely age 42, but she can still be killed and she can still take her own life. But, if she wants to, she can live forever as long as she continues drinking this elixir. So Elena Macropolis stays biologically the same age for the next 300 years. And during this time, she goes through a lot of different characters. And they all have she goes through a lot of different names. So they all start with EM. And so that's why she's EM for short, because, sometimes she's Elena Macropolis, sometimes she's Elsa Manning. I don't remember the names exactly off the top of my head. But regardless, because she's living for a very long time, she has to adopt these different identities, these different public identities, so that, people don't find out that she's living for a very long time. But at a certain point, EM finds her prolonged existence just boring, right? And this is in part, according to Williams, because there's nothing new for her to do. She's done everything that the kind of person she is. She's done everything that she wants to do, given the kind of person she is. So, she wants to cook, climb some mountains, bake bread, play snooker, whatever. But she's done these things so many times now. And over the course of her life, all the things that she wants to have done, she's done hundreds, thousands of times. Now she gets no enjoyment, no fulfillment out of anything. She's bored. Life has become tedious. So think about it like this. For a person like her, she's done everything she wants to do, and she now finds she's just repeating things over and over again. And she's now entered what will become an eternal state of boredom if she doesn't stop taking the elixir. She keeps taking the elixir, she stays alive, but she's never going to get any enjoyment out of life, never going to get any fulfillment. So as the story goes, she actually chooses to end her life by not retaking the elixir. She stops taking the elixir and dies of old age, because actually she's 342. when she dies. So Williams thinks that life gets boring because we exhaust our categorical desires. But what are categorical desires? Categorical desires for Williams are desires that require us to continue to live, but which are not the mere desire for continued existence. You might desire to continue to live just because you enjoy life. But for Williams, a categorical desire is not that desire, but one that implies a desire for future life. So perhaps, for example, you want to travel the world. If you have a desire to travel the world, this is categorical. This is a categorical desire, because if you want to travel the world, you have to stay alive to do that. If you die, then you can't travel the world. If you want to learn a new language, you have to stay alive, because you have to stay alive to travel a new language, to learn a new language. If you want to run a marathon, again, you're going to have to stay alive in order to get to that marathon, to run it. And so the thought here is that categorical desires are those desires that drive us into the future. They're very much a constitutive element of our identities, who we are, like deep down, our characters, who we are. And that's really what makes us up psychologically, mentally. Like, they're the things that keep us going. Like, you want to do this, you want to do that, and that's what pushes you in from one day to the next and makes you keep going. It's because you have categorical desires. Williams in his article also talks about conditional desires. The conditional desires are just ones that you have given that you're going to exist. So you might want, a suicidal person might still want to like eat well or have warmth and shelter, but they want those things as long as they're going to be alive. They might not want to live, but they still want to be comfortable. But categorical desires are different. They desire for certain things that are not the desire for life, but which imply desire for continued life, because you need continued life in order to get the object of those categorical desires, whether it be traveling the world, running a marathon, or learning a new language. So you might think here, well, isn't this a little bit weird? Like, so Elena Acropolis, EM, has these categorical desires, and then she does all these things that she wants to do many times over, and she gets bored. Why doesn't she just get new categorical desires? Like, well, why is that? So, I mean, it might seem obvious to you that, you want to run a marathon. You run the marathon. Now you're like, what shall I do next? I'm going to read this book. I'm going to read this book. And you go read the book. I read this book. I'm going to read all the books by this author. Oh, I've read all the books by this author. Oh, I'm now going to climb this mountain. Oh, I've climbed this mountain. Now I'm going to climb all the mountains. Now I'm going to climb all the mountains in record time. So each time you have a particular project like that, you complete it, you often, usually, maybe not always, but often, or usually get a new project. And why can't we do the same thing with categorical desires? So categorical desires do seem connected to projects in some way. Our projects seem to be expressions or manifestations of our categorical desires. So why not just get new categorical desires just as you get new projects? So getting new projects would seem to imply that you have new categorical desires. Well, something I mentioned briefly already is that Williams seems to think that our identities are in part constituted by our categorical desires. He doesn't think it's impossible for human beings to get new categorical desires, but he thinks that if we do get them, then we're going to become a different person. So the thought here is that, who you are, the person you are now, depends on the categorical desires you have. And if you were to get new categorical desires, you'd become a different person. You might think, well, if that's right, if Williams is right here, okay, the new person doesn't become bored. But Williams' thought here is, well, the new person isn't you. The new person is somebody else. Okay, you've staved off boredom in eternal life by becoming a different person. The question is whether you, as the person you are now, can stave off boredom. Williams thinks no. So Williams thinks it doesn't help to become, to get new categorical desires, because the person we're then talking about is a different person. So we, who we are now, can't avoid life becoming boring and meaningless if we try to live forever, because who we are now depends on the categorical desires we have now. At some point we'll exhaust those, and at some point then we will become eternally bored if we happen to be granted immortality. So one worry here for Williams, I raise this here quite briefly because it's related to what we're talking about with Tolstoy. It's not clear why immortality would retroactively undermine the meaningfulness of life. So take Elena Acropolis. Maybe her life became meaningless when she exhausted her categorical desires. That's fine. So after the point that she exhausted her categorical desires, after that point, her life became meaningless. But what about all those earlier points? Maybe her life was meaningful during those points. And maybe if we look at her whole life, maybe overall the whole life would be meaningless, because maybe a lot of the time would have been spent having meaning in not feeling fulfillment with the projects we were undertaking or the activities we were undertaking. But that doesn't mean we retroactively undermine the rest of it. So Elena Macropulis doesn't seem to live for very long afterwards. So if we were to balance up the person's life, perhaps then there's meaningfulness, lack of meaning, lack of meaning, lack of meaning. Maybe there's enough meaningfulness in the earlier part of her life to make her whole life meaningful. And even if not, those points still seem to be meaningful. But Williams seems to suggest, or at least can be read as thinking, that there's a retroactive undermining of meaningfulness, just as Tolstoy seems to be possibly read that way. But his argument really only seems to show that life becomes meaningless once we get bored, right? So once we're bored. So if you happen to avoid, like if you just think, if you live for, say, 10,000 years, and then in the first 9,999 years, you live a totally meaningful life, but in that last year, things get boring, and then you're just like, well, I'm going to stop now. Then that doesn't seem to make your overall, that we balance up that life. There's a year of meaninglessness and then a 9,999 years of meaningfulness. Why should we think that then the whole life is meaningless? It doesn't seem true. Like, we still got these meaningful parts earlier on. So, Williams has a little bit more work to do there. We have no reason yet to think that the fact your life becomes meaningless in the moment after you become bored, after you exhaust your categorical desires. We have no reason to think that because your life is meaningless after the point that you exhaust your desires, that everything before that point retroactively becomes meaningless. He has more work to be done to show that. So that's just a little worry with Williams. We can put that to one side, but it's a worry to think about if you're thinking about investigating this kind of issue more. But to summarize Williams, the way I think of him is presenting a kind of dilemma. So I think that he thinks that either we keep the same categorical desires and become bored, or we get new categorical desires and become a new person. So on the first horn of the dilemma, if we're living an eternal life, we're immortal, our lives become meaningless. On the second horn, it isn't really our life anymore. It's someone else's life. Like, so we've in a sense become a different person, and the person in the future is no longer us. So that person avoids boredom and meaninglessness, but that's not us. And then that person will eventually get bored and become a different person, and they'll only avoid boredom by continually becoming a new person. The thought here is a dilemma, and why we shouldn't desire. On the one hand, one question is about desiring immortality or an eternal life, and another question about the meaningfulness of our lives. And I take it that Williams thinks that we're not going to get a meaningful eternal life because we either become bored or a different person. Let's stop there.